Work seamlessly from anywhere on any device with Vodafone Unified Communications. Search Vodafone OneNet Business.
Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for the SigmaScape version 1.0, also known as O5N. This is the first new raid instance made available by patch 4.2 in Final Fantasy XIV, Rise of a New Sun. Before I derail the intro with a bunch of boo ring phantom train puns, let's stay on track. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your raid guide. As the encounter begins, 4 square telegraphs will appear on the platform. Move away from these to avoid death. Eventually, 4 ghosts will spawn, surrounded by a square barrier. Head on will have the boss ramming the platform, dealing proximity-based damage and knocking back all players. Move as far away as possible to reduce damage. 2 spotlights will then spawn, and the game will basically demonstrate that ghosts hit by this attack are immediately eradicated. Keep this in mind for later. Next up, players will be marked with this orange prey marker and spotlights will spawn on them. These spotlights will follow the targeted players for a short while before finally settling and blasting the platform. Move out of these as necessary. Diabolical headlamp will mark up a player with this lineup marker. Players will need to share this incoming damage by being in line from the boss with this player. Diabolical whistle will spawn a ghost that will tether to a player. Immediately after, 2 other players will be marked for prey and spotlights will begin to follow them around. The tethered player will need to force their ghost into a spotlight to destroy it. If the ghost should reach the tethered player, they will be transported into the passenger car where they will have to destroy the passenger ghost before being allowed to return to the platform. Doom Strike is a tank buster on the primary target that should be cooldowned and healed through. Next, 2 players will be marked by these large green AoE circles. Shortly after, these will spawn large tornadoes on the affected players, and they'll need to be moved away from others to avoid overlapping damage. The next diabolical whistle will spawn a number of ghosts on either side of the platform that will slowly make their way across to the other side before disappearing. Players will need to avoid getting in their way or they'll be transported to the passenger car as well. Next up, 2 players will be targeted by these large red circles. Shortly after, they'll drop down proximity markers underneath them, and players will need to move away from them to reduce damage. An easy way to handle this is to position these red markers to the back of the platform, so that the raid may continue to damage the boss during this. Acid Rain will do raid-wide AoE damage. Healers be ready with shields and heals. At this point, the boss will reappear alongside the platform and a number of putrid passenger ads will spawn. Tanks will pick these up while everyone else destroys them as quickly as possible. During this time, players will be marked with the green wind markers and they should spread away from others as necessary. Once all the ads are destroyed, players will be able to jump on the boss's back and destroy the Doom Chimney. This will return everyone back to the platform, but cause a cloud of smoke to afflict everyone with throttle. Players will have only a few short moments to find a way off of the platform before they suffocate and die. To do this, you'll willingly touch a ghost to be transported to the passenger car. Once inside, be sure to destroy your ad as quickly as possible to be able to return to the encounter. At this point, the fight will resume. The mechanics you've seen so far will repeat with some overlap. The basic principles of each remain the same, so it's just a matter of handling each in turn. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll dive into SigmaScape version 2.0. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.
With Vodafone OneNet Business, you can combine your landline.
Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for the SigmaScape version 2.0, also known as O6N. This is the second new raid made available by patch 4.2 in Final Fantasy XIV, Rise of a New Sun. The first time I ran through here, I had a real brush with danger, and I suffered a lot of paint, but I guess you could say I wasn't in the right frame of mind yet. My name is Ms. Tech, and I'll be your raid guide. You'll notice 4 elemental paintings around the room, and 4 sketches in front of each one. Using the duty action button in this encounter while standing on a specific sketch will activate a specific ability that will be used to counter mechanics throughout the encounter. Once the encounter begins, Demon Shatternook will appear on the platform. He'll begin with Demonic Howl, a raid-wide AoE blast that should be healed through. Goddess Shatternook is also active throughout the encounter, and while she can't be targeted, she'll slam the off-tank with auto attacks that can get nasty if ignored. Next up, Demonic Shear will target the main tank for high damage. Cool down and heal through this as necessary. Eventually, Demon will move to the center and begin to cast Possession on the fire painting. This will cause a massive AoE blast that will do high damage and debuff any player's hit. To avoid avoid this, players will use their duty action button on the water sketch in front of the fire painting to receive a fire resist up buff. Heal through some more AoE and another tank buster, and the boss will cast release. This will return him back to the center, where he will possess another painting. This time, he's possessing the earth painting. This will cause a massive earthquake, dealing high damage and debuffing anyone it hits. To avoid death, players will use their duty action buttons on the Air Force sketch in front of the earth painting. This will cause them to start riding a tiny Air Force mount that will lift them off of the ground, allowing them to avoid the earthquake completely. After the attack, players can dismount and resume their attacks on the boss. Next up, 2 players will be marked for prey and targeted by a sequence of small AoE circles. They'll need to move away from others and continue running away from the AoEs until the attack ends. More AoE and another tank buster, and then the boss will release and possess the next painting. This time, possession of the water painting will create a massive wave that will knock back, deal high damage, and debuff anyone it hits. To avoid this, one player needs to paint the rock sketch in front of the water painting to spawn a large boulder. The group will hide behind this boulder to avoid the attack. Players will also need to watch out for these small AoE circles that will spawn water spouts. Move away from these as necessary. The 4th possession will be the wind painting. One player will need to use their action button on the sketch in front of the wind painting to mount this pink Ghostbusters looking thing. They'll use their pet action button to blow away the easterly ads that spawn all over the platform, creating a safe area for the group to stand in. These easterlies will eventually explode, and you don't want to be caught in that damage. Demonic Pain will tether a few players to the boss with these pink arrow lines. These players will need to move away from the boss until their tether turns purple to avoid excess damage and debuffs. Next, all players will need to stack with the player marked for flash scale to share the damage. The boss will then release and then possess 2 paintings at once. Players will now have to deal with the mechanics of both paintings at the same time. The general principle remains the same. Simply use your duty action on the sketch in front of the possessed paintings to gain the ability that will allow you to counter the attacks. It is worth noting that once inside the mini airship, you won't be able to paint, so if you find yourself having to grab both, make sure you start with the sketch in front of fire first. Anytime Demon possesses more than one painting, you'll notice he clones himself to be able to cast both of the abilities of each painting at once. The hot clone can't be targeted. Instead, it's simply a matter of handling the extra overlap of mechanics. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into Sigmascape version 3.0. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time. Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for the Sigmascape version 3.0, also known as 07N. This is the 3rd new raid instance made available by patch 4.2 in Final Fantasy XIV Rise of a New Sun. You know, a lot of these intro puns go through a heavy screening process, but this time I just couldn't get any to load. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your raid guide. The first thing to note is the screens behind the boss. You'll need to get used to looking at these throughout the encounter as they will display what program the boss is loading. This can help you predict the incoming mechanics, allowing you to pre-position for each attack as necessary. Second, the outer area has a barrier around it that deals damage and applies paralysis on anyone standing on it. You'll have to be careful throughout the encounter not to be knocked into this. Magitech Ray will cast towards a random player. Move out of the way to avoid this. Arm and Hammer is a tank buster on the primary target. Be ready with cooldowns and heals. Eventually, the boss will cast Load. Looking at the screen will show you which program he's loading and allow you to prepare for the incoming mechanics. The possible programs to load are Ultros, Dataluma, Air Force, and Bibliotaph. Let's look at the mechanics of each one first. Loading Ultros program will cause a number of large AoE circles to appear under each player. You can stack to bait these to help you dodge them easily. Tentacle Simulation will spawn 4 tentacles under random players that will then cast Wallop. This does massive damage and should be avoided as necessary. Eventually, Ultros will spawn and should be picked up by the off-tank while the rest of the group focuses him down. The boss will fly up into the air and use Chain Cannon on the ground under a random player. Make sure you move out of this area or you will probably die. Immediately after, he'll cast Main Cannon in the same spot, dealing proximity-based damage. Move as far away as possible to reduce damage. Loading Dataluma will begin with a knockback from the boss. Players can position themselves with their backs to a corner to ensure they don't get punted into the wall and paralyzed. Next, 8 chakra burst circles will spawn in a set pattern around the room. Have a player stand in each one to avoid extra damage and debuffs. Eventually, Dataluma will spawn and should be picked up by by the off-tank. Avoid his large aura cannon attack while you burn him down. Loading Air Force begins with a point-blank AoE attack around the boss. All players will need to move out of melee range to avoid this. Next, Missile Simulation will spawn a number of missiles on each side that will slowly move across the platform. Dodge these to avoid high damage and debuffs. Bomb Deployment will spawn 2 bombs around the center of the platform with 2 coils. One of the coils will grow brighter than the other. To defuse this bomb before it explodes, have a player stand in the glowing coil. Eventually, an Air Force ad will spawn. The Air Force ad also has a large AoE attack that should be avoided. Loading Bibliotaph will spawn a number of demon summoning circles around the room that require 3 people in them to lock. If the circles are not locked in time, you'll summon extra ads. Eventually, Bibliotaph will spawn and should be picked up by the off-tank. Avoid his massive AoE as well while you burn him down. While the boss cycles through all of these programs, healers will also need to watch out for Diffractive Laser, a massive raid-wide AoE attack, and this prey marker on a DPS player that will deal damage and apply a fire debuff. As the encounter continues, the boss will continuously load these programs, and you'll have to deal with each mechanic in turn until the boss is down. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into the Sigmascape version 4.0. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.
With Vodafone's unified communications.
Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Sigmascape version 4.0, also known as 08N. This is the 4th raid instance made available by patch 4.2 in Final Fantasy XIV Rise of a New Sun. There's really no time to clown around with puns here. I need you all to step up, become the arrows that I know you are, and blitz this boss. My name is Mistech and I'll be your raid guide. The main thing to note about this fight is the use of trickery. Anytime you see these question marks on any attack, you can assume that the opposite effect will happen than what is displayed through the telegraphs. This can happen throughout the encounter, so keep your eyes open. Hyperdrive is a heavy-hitting blast on the main tank. Cooldown and heal through this as necessary. Blizzard Blitz is a large AoE attack that players can move into melee range to avoid. Flagrant Fire will mark up players with these orange markers that will need to be spread apart to avoid overlap. Thrumming Thunder will throw large column AoE attacks across the platform. Avoid these as well. Eventually, Kefka will start to trick you. You'll notice that the attacks are all named the same, but the question marks indicate that they do the opposite of what you would expect. Anytime you see a question mark on the attack, you essentially want to do it incorrectly or get hit by it to actually avoid the mechanic. Getting hit by any of these mechanics will also place a stacking vulnerability debuff on you, so you want to avoid this as much as possible. Eventually, Kefka will build up this tower, and players will have to watch out for attacks coming from it as well. When the boss casts Graven Image, be ready for an attack from the tower. A few of these don't have telegraphs, so you'll have to keep your eyes open. Generally, you'll see an orb on one side of the tower. Players will need to move out of this area to avoid getting blasted by the respective attack. However, if you see this light blue orb on one of the sides, you'll need to move towards that side of the platform. This will eventually do a knockback from this side, and you want to be positioned in such a way that you don't get knocked off the platform. Ultima Upsurge is a raid-wide blast that should be healed through. Be sure to stack in for the trick Flagrant Fire as well. Timely Teleport will have Kefka disappearing from the center circle and reappearing in the outer one. He will immediately cast an attack after, so players will need to be ready to dodge this by moving to the side of the outer circle. However, if he begins to cast Arrow Assault, players will need to move to have their backs to the center of the platform to avoid getting knocked off. Later on, players will need to watch for this gaze attack. As long as there is no question mark on the eye, make sure you turn away to dodge it. These mechanics will repeat until the boss is down. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll dive straight into Sigmascape Savage. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time. Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Sigmascape version 4.0 Savage, also known as 08S. This is the final Savage raid made available by patch 4.2 in Final Fantasy XIV Rise of a New Sun. Similar to 04S, this battle is split up into 2 distinct parts. This video will only focus on the first part and Kefka. If you're looking for God Kefka, click here. My name is Mistech and I'll be your raid guide. As the encounter begins, Kefka will cast Mana Charge. This mechanic essentially copies the configuration of his next abilities and stores them for later. He'll then cast a variation of Flagrant Fire. Players will need to either stack or spread depending on the markers and whether or not there's trickery involved. If at any time during a mechanic cast you see all of these question marks, you will need to do the opposite of what you would normally do given the mechanic telegraphs. This will occur throughout the phase, so be sure to keep your eyes open. Hyperdrive is a heavy-hitting magic tank buster that deals damage to the main tank and anything in a small radius around them. You'll need to avoid, cooldown, and heal through this as necessary. Next up is Mana Release. This will cast the same configuration of abilities he charged up earlier, so be ready to react in the exact same manner. Immediately after, Kefka will cast either a real or fake Thrumming Thunder. If it's real, players will stand in the safe zones to avoid it. If it's a trick, players will need to position themselves inside of an intersection of overlapping telegraphs to avoid all parts of the attack. Next up, Ultima Upsurge will deal raid-wide damage. Healers be ready with those shields and heals. Here, Kefka's tower will appear. From this point on, anytime the boss casts Graven Image, players will need to expect and react to a combo of mechanics from the tower itself. During a few of these Graven Image casts, Kefka cannot be targeted, and it's simply a matter of dancing around the tower mechanics in turn. The first Graven Image will spawn a large blue orb near the statue's left hand, and periodically place these AoE circles on the ground beneath players. The blue orb will first target 2 damage dealers with these line AoE attacks, and eventually target the remaining 2 damage dealers. While this attack does not do that much damage, these players can loosely spread around the platform to minimize the amount of overlap. Next up, 4 random players will be tethered to the statue. This tether indicates that they will be targeted for shockwave and soon be knocked back from the statue. Immediately after, the 4 damage dealers will be marked with stack-up markers. To handle this combo of mechanics, players will first stack during the Graven Image cast to bait the first set of meteor AoEs, before spreading for the incoming mechanics. Another set of meteor AoEs will appear while the orb casts Wave Cannon at the first 2 damage dealers. Remember that having the group loosely spread during this time ensures that players aren't getting hit by more than 1 Wave Cannon. The knockback tethers will appear, and these players should begin to move towards the statue to avoid getting knocked off the edge of the platform. While moving, you'll need to dodge another set of meteor AoEs. Lastly, the stack-up markers will appear, and the Wave Cannon orb will fire again at the remaining 2 damage dealers. Each damage dealer will now need to pair up with a tank or a healer for the stack-up, or the group will be afflicted with damage down debuffs. Due to the timing of the tether knockbacks, player pairs will each have an assigned spot on the platform to stack up in. Tethered players will essentially need to aim themselves at these assigned spots so that they're pushed into the proper position for the stack up. After the knockback, Kefka will create 2 timely teleport circles and teleport somewhere to the outside of the platform. Players will need to be ready to immediately get behind him as soon as the stack damage applies to avoid getting blasted with Revolting Ruin. Use sprint as necessary. Once he reappears, he'll be targetable again and you can resume your assault. Next up, he'll cast Light of Judgment. This is extremely heavy raid-wide damage that you'll need to mitigate as much as possible to survive through. He'll then cast Mana Charge, and the players will need to be ready to recognize and remember the configuration of the next set of mechanics. He'll cast Thrumming Thunder first, and players will need to find the safe zone and react accordingly. Next is Blizzard Blitz. Remember that if you see question marks on any of these attacks, to handle them in the opposite manner. The second Graven Image is next. The tower will move to the side and spawn a blue Shockwave orb. This orb has a chance of moving to the other side of the platform, so players be ready. Shockwave will knock back players from the side of the orb, and you'll need to pre-position yourself to knock it off the platform. You can also use knockback immunities as you please. Kefka will then cast Mana Release, and as the Shockwave hits, you'll see the same configuration of the 2 previous AoE attacks appear at the same time. With these 2 abilities pasted on top of each other, very specific safe zones based on the configuration of Mana Charge will appear. Players will need to quickly maneuver their way into the appropriate safe spot. At this time, I would also recommend the tank move Kefka to the edge of the platform to set yourself up for the incoming mechanics. Next up, another Ultima Upsurge to heal through, and 1 more Hyperdrive tank buster before the tower moves up. This next Graven Image will tether up all players. If you look at the statue, you'll notice that all of the damage dealers will be tethered to either the top left purple connection or the right yellow connection. The tanks and healers will all be tethered to the opposite connection the damage dealers are. The top left tether connection will target its players with Gravitas. This ability must be shared with 1 other player, and it will leave behind a puddle that applies a deadly bleed debuff to anyone standing in it. The yellow tether connection will target its players with Vitro Fire. This is an AoE attack that must be spread to avoid avoid overlap. To handle this combo, we have each damage dealer pair up with their tank or healer friend and stack in an assigned location. Gravitas will apply first, and then each player will spread a little bit to avoid overlapping Vitrifier. Immediately after, the statue will spawn either a large yellow orb on the right or a large purple orb on the left of the platform, indicating that side of the platform will soon be blasted by gravitational wave or intemperate will. All players must avoid this blast as necessary, and after they spread for Vitrifier, they'll need to ensure they're on the correct side of the platform to be safe from this attack. Once that blast occurs, each player pair will need to immediately stack back in together for the second Gravitas cast. Again, they'll spread to avoid overlap of Vitrifier. At the end of all this, Kefka begins to cast Arrow Assault, knocking back all players around him. Once you finish spreading for the last Vitrifier, all players will need to make their way behind Kefka to ensure they do not get knocked off the platform. Next, another Light of Judgment to cool down and heal through. He'll then cast Mana Charge again and another Flagrant Fire. Handle this as necessary. The next Graven image will cast either an Intemperate Will on the left or a Gravitational Wave on the right. Players will need to identify the safe side and move appropriately. Next, Mana Release will have you handling Flagrant Fire in the same way again. Another Thrumming Thunder, and players will have to move into a safe spot. One more Ultima Upsurge and another Tank Buster before the tower moves up again. This Graven image cast will first target players with AoE circles. Stack together to bait these for easy dodging. At the same time, the statue will either cast Indolent Will or Ave Maria, indicated by this purple eye or this yellow eye with a